This was the man who, by his own admission, was relieved to find a more efficient, less messy way to murder millions. He was not a frontline general nor a high-level politician in Berlin. He was a manager, an administrator. His name was Rudolf Höss, and his product was death on an industrial scale. He was the architect and chief administrator of the most infamous place on earth, the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp. This is not a story of sensationalism. This is the verifiable story of the man who built the machine, the system he perfected, and the two trials, one international and one national, that finally brought him to justice. This is the architect and the accounting. Our story begins in the spring of 1940. On April 27th, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler gave a new order: establish a concentration camp in the Polish town of Auschwitz, which the Germans had renamed Auschwitz. The man chosen for this job, its first commandant, was Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss. Höss's initial tenure would last 3.5 years, from May 1940 to November 1943. This was the foundational period. Under his direct command, the camp's original purpose, to incarcerate Polish political prisoners, was radically transformed. Höss would eventually be transferred to an administrative role in Berlin, succeeded by Arthur Liebehenschel and then Richard Baer. But as we will see, his story at Auschwitz was far from over. His superiors viewed him as an indispensable specialist, an expert in a field he himself had created. To understand Höss's achievement, you must first understand his design. Auschwitz was not one camp. It was a sprawling complex of 3 main camps, supported by over 40 smaller sub-camps. This tripartite structure was the key to its horrific efficiency, allowing for the simultaneous management of 3 distinct forms of persecution. First, Auschwitz I, the main camp. This was the administrative nucleus. It was a concentration camp, yes, but it also housed the central SS garrison and the offices that managed prisoner records and labor deployment for the entire complex. Second, Auschwitz II-Birkenau. This, in the words of the historical record, was the horrific killing center. Built nearby, Birkenau was the destination. From 1942, industrial-scale gassings took place here. This is where trains arrived almost daily, delivering transports of Jews from every corner of German-occupied Europe. And third, Auschwitz III, Monowitz, also known as Buna. This was the slave labor engine. Established to provide forced laborers for the IG Farben synthetic rubber and fuel works, it was the economic pillar of the complex, built on the suffering of those temporarily spared from Birkenau. This functional separation was a deliberate bureaucratic and psychological architecture. It allowed the SS to manage 3 operations at once: political incarceration in Auschwitz I, massive economic exploitation in Auschwitz III, and industrial-scale genocide in Auschwitz II. It was a diversified portfolio of terror, compartmentalized to prevent bottlenecks and normalize the daily routine of mass murder. In the beginning, mass murder was carried out by conventional, brutal means. But a pivotal, horrifying event occurred on September 3, 1941, that would industrialize the process. On this date, the first experimental mass gassing was conducted. It took place in the cellars of Block 11, the camp prison. The agent was Zyklon B, a prussic acid-based pesticide already in use at the camp for fumigation. The victims of this test were 2 specific groups: approximately 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick Polish prisoners selected from the camp hospital. The SS, under the initiative of Höss's deputy Karl Fritsch, deemed the experiment overwhelmingly successful. The gas, they determined, could annihilate thousands of people in few seconds. This test was the proof of concept for the final solution. And what did Commandant Höss think? He later wrote that the experiment had a calming effect on him. "I was always horrified of executions by firing squads," he confessed. "Now I was relieved to think that we would be spared all these bloodbaths." The bloodbaths he was concerned about were not those of the victims, but the psychological toll on his SS men. The method had been found. The machine was now ready. By 1944, Germany was losing the war. The Red Army was destroying the Eastern Front, and the Allies had landed in Normandy. Any rational state would have diverted all logistical resources, especially trains, to its collapsing military. But the Nazi regime was not rational. It was ideological, and it had one final, terrible piece of business: the extermination of Hungary's Jewish population. For this, they needed their specialist. Rudolf Höss was recalled to Auschwitz. He returned not as the administrative commandant, but as the local SS garrison commander, to personally oversee the arrival and gassing of nearly 500,000 people. This operation was so central to his story, it was named after him, Aktion Höss. The logistics, devised by Adolf Eichmann and Höss, are staggering. Between May 15 and July 9, 1944, just 56 days, nearly 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in 147 trains. The plan aimed for 12,000 people per day. To manage this unprecedented volume, Höss implemented a key logistical innovation. He had a 3-track railway siding built inside the Birkenau complex. Previously, trains stopped outside. This new railway was a direct conveyor belt to the gas chambers, streamlining the process from arrival to extermination. The sheer volume of Aktion Höss overwhelmed the system. The 4 large crematoria, running at maximum capacity, were unable to cope with the number of corpses. Höss and his men resorted to a more primitive method, digging massive open-air pits near the gas chambers and burning the bodies en masse. This was the grotesque, frantic reality of the slaughter Rudolf Höss personally directed. When the war ended, the Allies had to confront an unprecedented question: how to deliver justice for an unprecedented crime. The legal framework had already been established. The 1943 Moscow Declaration, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, created a 2-track system. Track 2 led to the famous International Military Tribunal, IMT, at Nuremberg. Track 1 mandated that a perpetrator like Höss, whose crimes were fixed to Auschwitz in Poland, be sent back to that nation to be tried. But first, Höss had a critical and chilling appearance at Nuremberg. It is essential to distinguish him from the high-profile defendant Rudolf Höss, Hitler's deputy. Rudolf Höss, the Commandant, appeared on April 15, 1946, not as a defendant, but as a witness for the defense. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Under oath, Höss calmly and procedurally confirmed his role. He confirmed his personal orders from Himmler for the final solution. He confirmed his own estimate that over 2 million Jews had been killed at Auschwitz. His flat, bureaucratic testimony provided the court with a high-level, first-hand confirmation of the entire extermination program. Following this testimony, Höss was extradited to Poland. His own definitive trial began on March 11, 1947, in Cracow. He was tried by the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland. The Polish indictment was staggering, charging him with the murder of millions. The trial was swift. Höss was found guilty and sentenced to death. On April 16, 1947, the sentence was carried out. The location was a profound, final act of symbolic justice. Rudolf Höss was not hanged in a prison. He was transported back to Auschwitz I and hanged on a gallows erected in the courtyard next to the former crematorium, in front of gas chamber 1. The architect of the camp was executed at the very site of his first experiments in mass murder. But the Höss trial in Cracow had a significance that in some ways went beyond Nuremberg. Polish prosecutors felt the IMT did not engage sufficiently with the suffering of the Polish people. The Cracow trial was Poland's chance to redress this deficit, to tell its own story of suffering and reclaim its judicial sovereignty. And the Polish authorities wanted one last thing from Höss. During his imprisonment, they had him write his extensive memoirs. This text, Commandant of Auschwitz, is his final, terrible confession. It was a sophisticated form of justice. It forced the perpetrator to become the chief witness against himself for all of history. The verifiable story of Rudolf Höss, locked in his own testimony and his own hand, is not one of a monster, but of a man. A man who, in his quest for bureaucratic efficiency, engineered the greatest mass murder in human history. It is a story that, for the sake of our future, must be told, must be verified, and must never, ever be forgotten.